Welcome back, horror fans, cinephiles, and Giallo enthusiasts. And this is episode 1 of a new podcast series that we will be doing called Giallo Adjacent. For the first episode, we decided to cover the 1980 William Friedkin film Cruising. I am joined here by my good friend Nathan, and why don't you introduce yourself to the good folks?
I'm known on YouTube as the Hot Dog Prophet. I don't have a lot of videos, but I'm working on some right now. And my good friend Tanner, also called TheKingInGiallo, has invited me on to talk about some stuff, and I'm excited to talk about William Friedkin's Cruising. So I have the Arrow Blu-ray right here. I have the alternate cover on. If you could see that beyond the glare.
I was gonna say, I was like, I have the Arrow cover, but I've never, I guess, flipped it. I didn't. I'd never seen that, the alternate cover.
Yeah, most of the Arrow covers have an alternate, and I was going to try to switch it to the original Al Pacino just looking poster, but it didn't have that. It just had two different original posters, and I preferred this one because I think thematically it's more interesting to have the picture of Stewart and is his actual name Steve Burns in the movie? I call him Al Pacino, but like it's Steve Burns, right? Is the character's name or whatever?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, moving on.
Which was real funny. It was really annoying in the Friedkin commentary because he kept referring to him as the persona. Like he kept calling him by the gay character he's trying to. And I was like, who is he talking about? And for a second, I thought he was talking about the real life police detective that the character was based on.
Jurgensen.
And I'm like, who is he? And then it took me like the 10th time he said the name to realize, oh, I was like, that's the character he's playing. Okay. We're going deep on this one.
Yeah. It's funny how he talks. I did listen to some of the commentary track where it's just him. And then I listened to a good amount of the one where it's him and Mark Kermode, the film critic. And he is funny, like unintentionally and intentionally. Friedkin is funny. But like just as example, there's we'll get into this later, but there's differences in the versions. There's like 3 different versions of Cruising. And you and I have seen the final version, essentially the 3rd version, which was altered from the 2007 DVD version. And the 2007 DVD version has a moment. Do you remember that moment? And we'll get to this later, but do you remember that moment where Al Pacino is tailing the Stewart character, and he's outside his apartment, and it just shows Al Pacino's back as Stewart is walking in. So in the 2007 version, they do this weird iris in effect on Al Pacino. And that's completely removed from the 2019 Arrow version. And on the commentary track, Kermode says, now there was originally an iris, like this strange effect. He didn't know what an iris in was, so he didn't call it that. But he said there was this strange effect where it kind of orbed onto Pacino. And Friedkin's response was, I don't recall that. And it's like, it just made me laugh because it's like, you either don't remember what you did in your own cut, or you're like, I don't want to talk about that. That was a stupid decision, and I don't want to talk about it. So he's funny like that.
Which is funny because based off of hearing Friedkin do interviews and commentary and other things for the movie, it wouldn't surprise me if it was either of those reasons. Like, he kind of seems a little like he had a hard time remembering everything. And then he also is trying very hard to instill this aura of mystique and like, who knows? But it's really funny because in the commentary track, he does say things definitively.
Yes.
And then he catches himself and then goes,
yes.
Or is it? Or something like that, where you're like, okay, so you basically answered it. You answered what your version is. But now you're trying to...
I noticed that. He'll say, and then this happens, and then he'll wait a second, and he goes, or it appears to.
Yeah. So we should say that there will be spoilers throughout this video. So if you have not seen the film Cruising, you might want to stop and check that out. If you don't mind spoilers, then, just strap in and have a good time. So, um, first thing we should probably talk about is just.
You can pick up the Arrow version, but I noticed recently there's a version on YouTube.
Oh, is there?
Sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
Oh, no, no, no. I was going to say we should probably begin by talking about the movie's plot, the characters, what the story is. And so, what I will say is this is based on a book by Gerald Walker, which I did have the liberty of reading a couple months ago. I read it kind of quickly within like a work week while I was at work, while I had downtime. And I read it in preparation for doing this. And then we unfortunately had to kind of postpone our initial recording of this podcast. And so 2 months later, I'm kind of like, I'm trying to pull out from the ether of like what I remember. But what I find interesting about the book and then going to the movie, which we will talk about the movie right away, is that the book came out in 1970, where I am right now in my channel, I'm in 1971. So I just got out of 1970, I think in February. But it's interesting to see what Giallo films were around at that time. And even though, Giallo films don't necessarily translate over into what was going on in America, it was interesting to see what was going on in Giallo. And you and I both watched Hatchet for the Honeymoon fairly recently, which was 1970. And so it's interesting then to see 10 years later, the film version of Cruising came out, which is February 15th, 1980. And do you want to talk about the plot of the film?
Yeah, so I just wanted to bring this down because I took notes while watching the film. And okay, all right. So the movie. So there's okay. This is I don't know how to do this. Okay, so when the movie starts, you're immediately like, well, this reminds me a lot of New York Ripper, but we'll get into that, I guess, when we do our rating. But basically, the movie starts with a boat, with like a trawler or something, and they find body parts. Then, I think I'm trying to remember. Did the police find the body parts right after that? I think that's where it skips to.
Yes.
And Jurgensen, who is the guy who is the actual cop that the story is based on.
They find the body parts right away.
Yeah, yeah, and so and it. The funny thing is, the guy who finds the parts on the boat, I think he's dubbed, probably because people were yelling off camera. I don't know, but that makes it feel a little bit more Giallo-y because his voice is odd. And there's other parts in the movie that have that going on. But so they find it, and they're like, the police think there's like a serial killer going on. But then we go to the leather bar, or actually, sorry, then we go to outside, basically just New York City streets around that area of the leather bar, and we find a couple of what would be the appropriate thing to call them? Are they transsexual prostitutes or are they trans women? Like, what would you call them?
Oh, what Friedkin referred to them as, he kind of just referred to them as hustlers, and he was saying that like they're the way he referred to them was that they were gay men, but they were dressed like women. But he didn't say they were cross dressing, and he didn't say they were trans. But again, this was kind of, the commentary was recorded before trans really kind of took off in the zeitgeist.
Yes.
But I also think that even if you were to ask him nowadays, he'd probably say, no, that wasn't my intention. But I think they are intentionally going for a somewhat androgynous look, but they're not. They don't feel that they are themselves women. I think it's going, but they are out there cruising for sex.
Yes, exactly. Well, they're specifically. I guess they're not technically cruising. They're specifically hustling, like you said. He calls them hustlers. They're prostitutes essentially. I think they're looking to get paid. I think
yes,
for what they're doing, and so then we meet Joe. I'm blanking on his name. What's his last name again? The dude from Maniac.
Joe Spinell.
Spinell. Okay, so he's a cop. It's a couple of cops. They might as well be like, this is a very dated reference, but they might as well be like Brer Fox and Brer Bear. Like his sidekick is just like I'm a dummy, and he's complaining about how his wife has left him, and how horrible she is. And the interesting thing is, and I don't know if you know this, you probably do, but this is a little trivia thing that anybody could look up, but I feel like it has to be noted. His Spinell's wife had just left him 2 weeks before he shot that.
Whoa, I didn't know that.
So, I isn't that crazy?
Because I know that's a character thing for
Right.
him.
Yeah.
That's crazy. I wouldn't be surprised if Friedkin had made that change on the fly, because he says that he really wants his actors to actually embody the character to the point that they, you know, there's no difference between them, which for a movie like this is gonna be very difficult to do.
Famously, he slapped one of his actors on The Exorcist to get a realistic, like, shakiness for a scene. So yeah, he's into the real deal. But so what's interesting is,
The 1970s were rough.
yes, and this is 1980, so it's right at the tail end. And what's really interesting, the the two cops harass the prostitutes, we'll call them, and then they proceed to force them to service them in the car. And what's so crazy about that is, you might say, I could see a lot of people complaining. They could say, oh, it's just the trope that the person who hates gays is gay themselves. But I think it goes much further than that. It's this really weird exploration of like their position and what it really means, and what does he really mean when he says the second guy says he hates women. Like, it's really strange way to start the movie, but it gives you the right, it gets you off balance, I think, in the way that he wants you to be off balance. And then we just see this guy start walking by the car, and then he heads over, whoever it is heads over to the leather bar. And I don't know. Yeah, let me ask you real quick: how in depth do we want to get on this movie? Because I could describe every aspect of this movie. It's so interesting to me.
Let's go deep. So what I will add is that what's interesting, I mean, I hope this isn't jumping. It technically kind of is, but in terms of how the cops are behaving towards these gay hustlers, you know, and like what you're saying, and I agree, it is a very common overused trope to do the whole the homophobe is actually gay, but you do actually see Joe Spinell's character later as a member in one of the leather bars, and I think you see him twice. But oh no, you see him.
You see him.
You see him
you
in the
also
bar,
see
and
him
then you see him
cruising in the park.
in the Ramble. Yeah, you see him approach Al Pacino's character in the Ramble, which is that area in the park under the bridge. And
Yes, where it's bathed in blue light.
Yep. Another thing that Friedkin says, and again, this is what he says, but it's also kind of like maybe he should take a little bit responsibility for what he's doing. But what he says is the whole nature of going into the gay underground and this culture, the leather bars and everything, was that for him, he was like, ooh, I've never seen that in a mystery, at least not on film. And so I'm not trying to make a statement. I'm not trying to make a suggestion or insinuate anything about these people or the culture. I just think it's fascinating.
Yeah. He said it's a background for a murder mystery. He said on multiple occasions, and
Yes.
I believe him. I believe him that those are his honest intentions for the material. I think that the gay community has every right and had every right to be incredibly offended by the film. Because I think it's this type of thing where he said himself, it's like at the time, it's like a bad time to do that, basically. And so that was really the issue.
Yeah, because they were starting their protests, and that was basically like for a lot of what would you say? Not normal people, but for a lot of just the more hetero people, the majority of people in society, they were starting to see the protests on the news and starting to hear about this, and this is also in the decades since when homosexuality was considered like a mental derangement. And so views are changing. The ideas that society has are slowly changing, and they were starting to now voice their concerns and make their presence, known in a very powerful political way. And At the same time, they got this movie coming out, and they're like, motherfucker, this is not the time to do this movie. Not now. Don't do this now. You're gonna make us look bad. And yeah,
So the thing, this is the thing. This this is the thing. If you, I was going to say real quick, if you take what happens in the film literally, I can understand why it's very offensive, because it's difficult not to draw certain conclusions if you take it literally, and that's one of the keys to my interpretation of the film. Because I don't know, we'll get into it later, but I do think that on a simple, basic logic level, a lot of things do not make sense. But then there are other things that do. You just have to think about them hard. And so I think that he succeeded, freaking succeeded in some of his confusion being useful, but some of it is just gonna it's gonna make people confused. They're not gonna understand, and the only thing they're gonna have to latch onto is this movie's about gay people and there's killers in it. So I think that that's the issue that people have. But I will say something real quick. I have watched a number of people talk about this movie, review this movie, and most people most people comment, as well as they should, I think, about its connections to the real gay community, which obviously the film attempts to distance itself from. But the thing is, I think a lot of these people who review the movie, they kind of want to sidestep the matter of the difficult questions surrounding it by just saying, "Oh, well, the movie's not good anyway. The movie's bad anyway. You know, really, you don't need to talk about the movie anyway because it's just confusing, stupid crap." And and it does, and so I just want to say, like, you're allowed to have whatever opinion you want. If you think the movie's bad, that's fine. I don't think that you can just sidestep the conversation by saying that the film is like poorly made. And there are parts of the film that you can argue, there are lines in the movie you could argue are stupid, but I still think that they're there for screenwriting purposes. Like, for instance, early on in the film, Paul Sorvino, who is the commanding officer, chief, I don't know, I forget what he is, he's looking at one of the dead bodies.
Captain Edelson.
Edelson. He's looking at the first dead body, who, by the way, I have to say real quick, the first guy who we see get killed is great. I actually genuinely really feel bad for this guy, and I really empathize with him. And he just seems like such a genuine, sweet person.
Yeah.
You know, that you don't want to see this
I
happen
was
to.
saying, I every time I've seen this movie, that first kill always is very like what's crazy is empathetic, in where it's like, I'm not gay. I've never been in the situation, will never be in the situation, but the helplessness, the vulnerability, and like the humanity, and just like the fear, like there's so much to it that like it makes it way more disturbing than the majority of kills I've seen in slasher type movies, because it like level of believability, and it's insane.
Yeah, even the way that the knife goes in first is so believable. I remember when I first saw it thinking, "Oh, that's good. That's really good," because you don't it's a very I'm sure they're doing the old-fashioned trick that either the knife is retractable or like there's something, going on there, but it doesn't matter because it works. He's stabbing him in the back and he's like on his stomach, and it really works. And it's true, like, you and I are not gay, we've never been in that situation, but we've been in sexual encounters, not to brag, and like, so like when that happens you are vulnerable, and so the character is in a vulnerable position, and he honestly just, the actor, he just plays it in a way where you really care, like you're like genuinely feeling bad. He just seems like a really innocent person who is just out to have some fun. He's not sleazy. He's not disgusting. He's just an innocent person. And so that, to go along the discussion, is the film homophobic? Well, I mean, that part of it isn't. That part of it can't be called that. I don't know.
Correct me if I'm wrong. When it goes to like the third or fourth stab onwards, it does really quick cuts to, I think, because it's so quick, I'm pretty sure it's to like quick clips from gay porn, where someone is like, where it's like thrusting in.
Famously, yes, the film has subliminal cuts to gay pornography. I say it like that because in the 2007 version, especially, it kind of lingers a bit too long, and it's just like that's not really subliminal. In the 2019 version, the cuts are quicker, so it's better, and the colors are proper. So, and that is how you're supposed to do a subliminal cut. It's supposed to be like so quick you're not sure if you saw it. But yeah, it's like Fight Club. It's one of the few like mainstream films that has porn in it.
Moving on from there, we meet Al Pacino's character, Detective Steve Burns, and he gets called in by Paul Sorvino's character, Captain Edelson, and he gets hired to go undercover.
Well, he asks him if he's ever had his poles smoked by a man. Yeah, and it's like, oh, I asked that for a good reason. It was to see, and it's like, yeah, whatever. That comes off so weird how he just says that out of nowhere. But anyway, yeah.
Just like, are we talking business here?
Yeah.
Or?
Yeah, it's just like, sir, I'm at work right now. If you want to call me later, ask me these things.
He gets hired to go undercover to try and use himself as bait because he fits the profile of the previous victims, and their hope is that he can somehow catch the eye of the killer, get him into a situation where they can actually jump on him and arrest him for an attempted murder. And what's interesting is that Al Pacino's character takes on the role because he's purely motivated by the idea that if he pulls this off, he can actually get promoted to detective, and he is a rookie. So for him, this would be like sidestepping like years of just mundane police work in order to actually get this. So for him, there's a lot of incentive to actually do it. And it's like, this is really big in terms of a career move for him.
Right. As opposed to a character who's like, something has to be done about these killings, and I'm going to see justice yeah.
Oh, and then this is something I always kind of miss, but pressure is also on the police department to solve it, not just because it is a string of murders, but because, what is it, the Democratic Convention is supposed to be coming in town.
The Democratic Convention is coming to town.
They have to.
Yeah, and they're like, and the mayor specifically tells Sorvino.
He tells him, listen, we got a lot of people who come to visit here on the 4th of July, and they're not going to go in the water if you start talking about this shark.
Yeah, I was going to say, he tells them we can't close the beaches on the 4th of July. It's the biggest day of the year. No, he tells them, yeah, what's really interesting in a line that I really, really wonder if they'd already started filming, like, obviously they'd already started filming, but I wonder if they'd already started been dealing with protests from the gay community at this point, because the mayor has a line, every gay group in the city is knocking on my doorstep, and you kind of feel like, oh, I wonder if that's actually, like, not from, like, the script, but taken from I don't know, it's hard to tell, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Something interesting I noticed upon my recent rewatching. So I was going into that with the idea of, we'll talk about this later, but the idea that the film crews were being protested while they were filming the scenes outside, and
right,
they were so vocal to the point that they actually couldn't use any of the audio they had recorded. They had to redo it all. Right. You actually can tell.
Which again,
you can tell.
The dubbing. So, yes, and the dubbing, in my opinion, when we get to the end, the dubbing is one of the things that will be part of the score. Yes.
It's funny. I didn't consider that, because for me it wasn't like an intentional, or it wasn't something that, I don't know, but that's a good point. But so yeah,
it's just a thing that subconsciously, to me, I couldn't help but think of that. But right. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
So Steve Burns, he gets a room in this apartment, which is known to just basically house gay men. And so he's really thrown himself in it. Oh, and also so this is a big change from the book. He has a girlfriend and or a fiance, and he can't talk with her about what's going on because, he goes out to this apartment. He meets his neighbor, who I forget what his name is, but he is the most consistent piece of this story from the book. So, do you remember? Ted. So he is the closest thing to the original book. The character's almost the same. His dialogue is almost verbatim. When I was reading the book, it was like every scene was like entire chunks of lines where I'm like, that's literally okay. So they literally just lifted all of his dialogue for his scenes.
Right. Well, so, I mean, probably Friedkin thought that dialogue actually rang true for one reason or another.
And so the first scene that they actually kind of go out, it's like, hey, you want to go grab some coffee? They go outside and they're talking as they're walking down the street. If you know it, you notice it, and it's completely ADR'd because all that footage was unusable. And then when they go to the cafe and they're continuing their conversation, it's also ADR'd because they, again, all those takes were unusable.
Right. And real quick, Ted, I got to say, he is possibly my favorite character in the film. He talks about how he's writing an old-fashioned romantic comedy play, and he feels like a character from a romantic comedy. He doesn't feel like he's supposed to be in this movie. He's very, you feel a lot for, you empathize with him. He feels very like warm, and he's not annoying, and he's not. First of all, nobody in this film has the stereotypical gay voice, and he doesn't have that. He doesn't have any of those things going on. He's just a really human guy, and he develops a relationship with the main character.
Very down to earth.
Yes, very down to earth. His dialogue it's interesting. His dialogue really does feel real. It makes sense that he kept it from the book because he probably felt like, okay, this is probably the most real thing, because one of the lines I remember specifically, he talks about, like, if I was Patty Chayefsky, people would know who I am. And it's like, nowadays probably, normal, like, I don't say normies, but people who watch this movie might not know who Patty Chayefsky is. But back then he was famous. He's the guy who wrote Network. So, like, stuff like that, I really liked. Oh. And he brings up the killings. And Ted says, and Al Pacino says, "Oh well, the cops will catch this guy." And Ted goes, "Are you kidding? If the cops catch him, they'll make him a member of the Vice Squad." And I thought that was a great line.
I'm wondering if I should say any book stuff right now or hold off, because there is some stuff that's sort of relevant. But
go ahead. No, go ahead. I know that the book is a little bit more about that relationship. I remember hearing, but I don't know anything else besides that.
Yes. So, a change that William Friedkin made for the movie was to make, let me see I forgot what his name is in the book. I have the note here. The character's name is John Lynch. John Lynch. So he changed the character to Steve Burns, which, fair enough, because the character is very different. So the book character is very homophobic.
He might as well be named Guy McPherson. Like, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. So the book okay, well, here's another interesting thing. The book is like 20 chapters or so. Every chapter it switches the perspective of who's the narrator. It switches between John Lynch, who is essentially Al Pacino's character. It switches between Captain Edelson, and it switches between the killer, who is his name is Stuart Richards.
So yeah, that's the same. That name is also used in the movie for a character. So that's okay.
Yes, yeah, and was a very interesting difference, and I understand why Friedkin made this change, but John Lynch in the book, he's very homophobic, very racist. Like, he's got a problem with Jews, and the captain is Jewish, and he's constantly just like, these homos, he's just like, he doesn't like them. But
he's like would you compare him to the cop in that Spinell plays?
Well, Spinell's, I feel like that cop that Spinell plays, I forgot his name is DeSimone or something.
DeSimone.
DeSimone, because you actually do see him in the leather bar, and you see him in the park where the gays are hooking up. I feel like beyond it being one of those self-hating gay stereotypes, I think he's actually putting on a performance for his partner. So, he might not suspect him of imbibing in this lifestyle.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But
sense.
John Lynch in the book, he's kind of portrayed as asexual. Like, he doesn't really have normal relationships. He doesn't really have he doesn't have a girlfriend, for one. He doesn't have a woman that he hooks up with. So so the
implication is that he may have always gotcha.
Right. And so when he starts meeting Ted, it's stronger in the book, the idea that maybe he is gay. Maybe he's starting to actually he actually starts having to face this side of himself. Like, am I? But if I remember correctly, he doesn't really have that conversation with himself. If I remember correctly, it doesn't really come up, but as the reader, you're like, I see what's going on here. And in the movie, Steve Burns, the main character, Al Pacino's character, is portrayed as being very heterosexual. He has a girlfriend or fiance, and that change was because Friedkin thought the way the character was in the book was a little too, it just wasn't that everyday, that everyman. So he was like, well, let's make the character a little bit more familiar, and and the audience can latch onto this character as he goes into this weird underground. So I get that change.
That's the thing is if you don't have, I think that makes sense, because otherwise there's no arc, or there's no there's nothing meaningful about him descending into this other world unless he comes from his own world of some kind. If he has no identity, that he can almost become anyone and it doesn't matter, which is its own interesting kind of angle, but it's just not, I think, it wouldn't work with this movie. This movie, I'm going to say right now, this movie is, I think this film is, and this is not hard to figure out, but I think this film is primarily about identity when it comes to the themes.
Yes.
So I think he focused everything around that.
Yes. And another thing that is, you may not know this. I mean, you probably do, but someone listening may not know this. The book doesn't have any of the leather bar stuff. That's not a part of it whatsoever.
Right.
So Friedkin deciding I want to go into this world was like, okay, well, now my character needs to be a little bit more familiar, or else, because before it purely was just the cop was having to play this gay character so he could go out in the bars and kind of potentially meet the killer.
Which I think, on its own, without the leather bar stuff, I think that's more homophobic in terms of the implications. And I think that Friedkin actually did make it a little less so by associating it specifically with the leather bars, because I think that they point out in the film rather clunkily that this is not the mainstream of gay life, but it's it's more interesting, it's different, it's weird, it has an edge, and that's what drew Friedkin to it. But the book, just the fact that it's just gay life and you're looking for a killer, it's there's a little bit more of are you implying that gay people are just killers? I mean, I haven't read the book, but that's what it sounds like. What would you say as someone who read it?
You don't get that so much from the outside, but when you do spend time with the Stuart Richards character, he's very interesting as a book character, because He's very fascinating. A lot of his time is in, when it comes to his chapters, is him talking about his recent sexual encounters with different women. He's actually bisexual, and he has like a harem of like, oh, I've have sex with this one woman, this other girl, and I wish I had taken notes, because it's actually kind of funny, his complaints about each different one, like, this one is too much like this one's too much like this. But
Oh, so in the book, the killer is Jerry Seinfeld.
so that is an interesting thing, and like that is very much that stereotype trope character of like, oh, I'm gay and I hate that side of me, so I'm gonna kill, I'm gonna kill that side of me by killing others. And so,
and I think it's fair to say, that, I'm just gonna say real quick, I think it's fair to say that the not Stuart Gordon, that's the director, Stuart Richards character,
Stuart Richard,
whatever it is, Stuart Richard. I think it's fair to say that in the film as well, he is the closest connection to anything that's offensive about the material.
Yes.
Because he maintains some of that, like, there's a connect, he hates himself, so he's killing people like him. It maintains that in the film.
There's a part near the end where Stuart Richards reminisces about like a time, I think he was out with his dad and his dad's friends, or his like uncles or something, and I think he got like thrown off of a boat into the water or something around that equivalent, and he was like asking for help and whatever, and the men were basically very much like, don't help him, let him figure it out. And that kind of instilled in him a lot, but essentially this distrust. And God, I wish that I wish I could recall more from the book, more so than I do right now.
For the record, for people watching this, we were planning on doing this like a couple weeks ago or a month ago or something, and we were going to do a stream as well. And 2 months ago, sorry. And so all this stuff just kept coming up and blah, blah, blah. And so we had stuff prepared. I have notes, but, it's understandable. Tanner doesn't remember everything from the book and everything. So unfortunately, we're not as prepared as we could be for this one. We'll be better next time. This is our first podcast for this thing. So, but okay. So I wanted to talk about real quick. So pretty soon there's a scene where Pacino talks to a guy about handkerchiefs.
Yes.
And the scene, yeah. So in the scene, he basically asks him, like, what's the deal with the handkerchiefs that they wear? And he explains to him the code with the handkerchiefs. He explains, if you have this handkerchief, it means you want this favor from someone. If you have this handkerchief, it means you want to provide it for someone else, so on and so forth. And he explains to him that the yellow ones mean that you like, I'm just going to say water sports, because that's the term that someone else could, yeah. But real quick, by the way, that's Powers Booth, Cy Tolliver from Deadwood, who explains all those things to him, which is fun. Friedkin says it's his first role. I don't know if that's true, but Friedkin says that on one of the commentary tracks, that's his first role.
Yeah, he said it was his first film role.
Yeah, so and he's great in it, and he explains it to him. So he explains to him what the handkerchiefs do, and then in the very next scene, this dude sees this really Mad Max looking dude. He sees Pacino with the yellow handkerchief, and he says, "See, you're into water sports?" And then Pacino says, "Oh no, I just like to watch." And then the guy is like okay with it for the second. Then he gets mad at him, and he's like, "Look, if you're gonna wear that handkerchief, then you're gonna be open.
Take that damn handkerchief out."
Yeah, which is honestly pretty reasonable. But what's interesting about this is originally these scenes were reversed. Originally, he came in there with the handkerchief just to fit in, and then he went to Powers Booth, and Powers Booth explained to him, "No, this is what the handkerchief's for." He reversed those scenes in editing. Friedkin did to create the implication that actually he knew damn well what he was doing. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yes. The implication now, the way that it's edited, is that Pacino knew what he was doing, but he kind of backed out. He was a little afraid at the last second to actually take part. That's what it feels like to me. And again, some people can look at that and say, well, the original, it doesn't really mean anything because the original version, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, no, 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 it does. The film isn't done until it's done. It's not done until you edited it. So I consider that scene really interesting just on the basis of, like, what it implies about the character. And then I have another note here. I have a note. It just says, Pacino appears to be doing gay shit.
Oh, he's
and
the second or third bar he goes to in the movie, he's dancing and he has someone hands him a handkerchief that's like soaked in amyl nitrates and he's huffing it and he's like
amyl nitrate.
Really?
Well, not even that. Not even so. What this note?
Was he talking about before
what this note refers to, because it's. Yes, it's cryptic, but I know what I'm referring to in the note. What I'm referring to, and I love this about this film, is that there are scenes where Pacino will walk around a corner and it'll just cut. And you're like, did he do something just now? And you don't know. You have no idea what occurred because the film chose not to tell you. Like, for instance, he walks away with a guy who may or may not be the killer. At one point, this is the scene with Joe Spinell in the Ramble you were saying, and they walk around the corner and then it just cuts. We have no idea what happened when they run around the corner, and that's really interesting.
Right, and then on top of that, the next time he's with his girlfriend and they're having sex, it's playing. Well, okay, sorry. The first time they're having sex, he seems way more disconnected from her passionately.
So that's later. That's later on. That's later on.
Right. Well, there's two times they have sex after he's been, getting involved in this life. The first time, I think he's just very aggressive and he's just not even looking at her, and then the next time she's performing on him. And he can only hear the music from the leather bar clubs.
So what's interesting about that part is that happens right after he's propositioned by another man. And then he clearly thinks about it for a second and says, not tonight, or not right now, or whatever it is. And he walks away. And then it cuts to him with his girlfriend, Karen Allen. And she goes down frame. And you know what's happening. And then the sound leaves. You don't, because at first... I have this in my notes too. At first, you flat out hear dick sucking noise. Can we say that?
I'm sure.
Like, you flat out, you hear the sound. Yeah, you hear the sound of Karen Allen slobbing his knob, and then that drowns out, and you hear the leather bar, and the look on his face is like he's in pain. It's pretty intense.
It's crazy.
Yeah, it's pretty intense. And then the second murder occurs after that, I think. But
right. Oh, let's talk about this. So, some people may know this if you're vaguely familiar with the movie and the production. So, something interesting that the movie does. The actor who plays the killer in the first killing then becomes the victim in the second killing, and spoiler. The killer from the second killing then becomes the third victim at the hands of someone else. And the only thing that actually ties the killer persona throughout these, even though they're shifting it, the actor, is the voice. And funny enough, Friedkin says this on the commentary and he catches himself, is that he clearly is coming from a place of what he says is when he was inspired by the recent killings in like 78 or so, when he started writing it, when he started adapting it, is that in his opinion, yes. And in his opinion, the killings that were going on, the police weren't sure if it was one person, if it was multiple people. His opinion was it was numerous people. So I think kind of what he's doing in the movie by flipping the actors around is his way of saying there are multiple killers. The voice is kind of this, I guess it is the the thing that impels them to kill is the same. There's so many ways you can look at it, and he intentionally is cryptic about it.
There is an implication at one point that the two are developing like romantic relationship, and the implication comes in the way of a single line of dialogue, which is they regularly meet and they talk, and at one point they meet and talk, and there's always this air of friendship between them that may be something more, but there's one specific line where he says, Ted says that his partner, I think it's Gregory, is coming back, and he says it's Ted's turn to work because Greg, I guess, worked instead last time, and so Ted's going to work so Greg can turn nut brown on the beach.
And those are exact lines from the book.
And that makes total sense because it sounds like something some person actually says, so, like especially at that time. So you're just like, okay, but like that. So what's interesting is Al Pacino says, Steve Burns says, "I wish there was something I could do for you or some way I could help you," which is familiar enough. But then Ted says, "You do help me, or you do." That's not really something you say to somebody that you're not in some kind of a relationship with. It was very specific, and it was a very interesting line, and it implied a lot.
For me, that wouldn't 100% tip it off, but it's certainly the type of line that is very open to that interpretation.
Yes, it's ambiguous, which is what Friedkin loves.
Which is, as you say, it's exactly what Friedkin is going for as much as possible. Did you know that? So he kind of has said some crap about Al Pacino, and Al Pacino was like, "Man, like,
Oh yeah,
he wouldn't
oh
tell
yeah.
me." He wouldn't tell me what the character was doing. So he was like, when we shot that last scene where I'm looking in the mirror and I look over at the camera, and he was like, "I don't know if I'm supposed to be gay or if I'm supposed to be the killer or I'm like what?" Because he wouldn't tell me. And I was like,
To quote William Friedkin, I don't give a flying fuck into a rolling donut what Al Pacino thinks. That's a direct quote. That's a
"That's
direct quote.
great."
And then he went on to talk about how he did care what other actors he worked with thought, but he felt that Al Pacino was incredibly unprepared and
Yes.
had the kind of Marlon Brando, I'm just going to not learn my lines so I'm more spontaneous kind of a thing. And so he didn't like Al Pacino. He said that he to this day thinks that Richard Gere probably would have been better. And I got to be honest, I kind of agree with him because Richard Gere has this aspect to him where you could see him being a gay dude, and you'd be like, yeah, he's a cool gay dude. It's interesting.
Yeah. No, he originally the script was originally made for Richard Gere in mind, and he said that he liked that Richard Gere had this androgynous quality to him, whereas Al Pacino did not have that at all. He was like very macho, very masculine, which is like does work in a different way. And if you are going into these clubs, leather bars, it might actually be more appropriate to look more macho than to look more androgynous.
It would. It would. Real quick, we forgot to mention Precinct Night, which is amazing.
Yeah, no, no. So I was, I have a few things to say about the leather bar scenes with Precinct Night being one of the things. So, William Friedkin was saying that he was like, this was an actual thing that they did at these clubs where everybody came in abiding by whatever the theme was that night. And so if it was Precinct Night, everybody came in dressed as a cop, whether it was a traffic cop or it was a regular street cop or whatever, but you were in a police uniform. And he was saying, so this is another very interesting thing. All of the scenes shot in the clubs, that's not a studio, that's not a sound stage, that is 100% in the leather bar, and those people are not actors, those are actual patrons. And he actually went in and just filmed what they're doing, and you see some fucking gnarly shit. There's a part, I think it's like the second or third night he goes there, you see a guy essentially on like a sex swing with like all of his limbs suspended, and you see another dude putting like grease, like Crisco on his arm, and you just see that, and then it
Crisco.
cuts to the guy, yeah, and then you just see the guy like, ah, and it's like 100% that is real. And, and the crazy thing was,
And
Friedkin was,
according to Friedkin, he shot the whole thing, right?
yes, and what he said is in his original film, it was much longer, and the MPAA kept saying you have to cut shit or you're getting an X rating. And so he said they cut more than 40 minutes out of the gay bar scenes, which means he shot hours of that footage. And he says about it, he says, yeah, honestly, it's fine that we cut it because it didn't really have any, it didn't further the storytelling and it didn't further any of the characterization. But it's like, dude, there's already like maybe 10 minutes of that in the movie. Could you imagine if it was fucking nearly an hour of just like, you're just watching like, it's so crazy. Because like I said, it's one thing if it's just like, oh yeah, you guys are going to go over here and you're going to pretend you're giving him a hand job. You're going to, be rubbing his back. It's all real, which is just like, it's this level of verisimilitude with like, it's fucking, it's just crazy. It's practically porn at that point.
They're not extras. Yeah, yeah. Well, it is porn, and what's interesting is I've heard some sources. As he said that in some areas, Friedkin said that he deliberately shot 40 minutes of pornography because he wanted the MPA to cut it out so he could keep the other stuff that he actually wanted in the movie. And I believe that because that's a typical thing people do in Hollywood. The most famous case is probably Team America World Police. But I think that makes sense because why would you need to see all of those things happening in the like it's just not necessary. Now I think that I think you see the perfect amount of them in the movie at this point because it's enough to go whoa, but not enough to make you go I'm just watching porn, you know?
Right, right, 100%. Um, Something funny also on to that is he was saying that Friedkin was saying that he was looking for the original footage because he wanted to put it back in like the 2019 re-release, and he was like, who was it, United something, whatever the company was, he was like, they got rid of it. He's like, that either means that they like
United Artists.
United Artists, yeah, he was saying like they got rid of it, which means they either like threw it away, burned it, or somebody took it home. I think somebody took it home.
No, I would if somebody took it home, that's great because that means the footage does exist somewhere. And even though it's porn, I think it'd be important to find that footage. It's very likely somebody burned it because back then that was an extremely typical thing to do was to burn footage. It's like there's no such thing as DVD special features back then. You would just burn everything so you had room to put the new footage that you needed. So, but you know what? I bet you're fucking right. I bet there's the very least there's a dupe or a VHS copy of that somewhere. I bet you, yes.
Yeah, crazy. So going back to Precinct Night, real quick, one last thing I'll say is Friedkin said every time he went to the bar and he filmed, whether it was a regular night or it was some sort of theme, he was following along. So on Precinct Night, he was dressed as a cop. On Jockstrap Night, he was in boots and a jockstrap.
Right. I remember hearing that, and he was like, "I was the ugliest guy there." And I'm like, that sounds fun. It's
Yeah,
like
yeah. Nobody hit on me.
this whole movie kind of reminds me of side note spoilers for The Wire. Can we spoil something from The Wire? Is that okay?
Go ahead.
I will not say the character's name, so it won't be technically a spoiler. But there is a character in The Wire who is a police officer who is a very hard nosed, really mean guy. And at one point, someone's in a gay bar, and the camera just pans, and that character's just sitting in the bar, doing the kind of look around where you're like, "Does anybody have any interest in me?" And you're like, "Holy crap!" And that's the only thing you see of that part of that guy's life, and I love that. Because it's just a little piece. And yeah, this whole movie kind of reminds me of that. You just think about, and we'll get into this when I get to my interpretation stuff, but it's like thematically, I'll just say this now. I think the thing that really attracted Friedkin about the gay lifestyle in this film is the notion of a double life, which back then was a necessity if you were going to be gay. But nowadays it's different. So I think that that's really what he was really into. But yeah,
100%, because that's more the direction than he takes the main character in for the duration of the movie. And ultimately what is the end is like, what happened? Did his double life take over? Did a third life did he awaken something, you know?
yes, exactly. If I'm going to be critical of the film, there's a couple of lines of dialogue which I think are a little poor, but they don't ruin the movie. But I want to point them out real quick. In the scene where Paul Sorvino Edelson is looking at the second corpse that's been stabbed in the back. It's actually the first, official victim in the movie, but it's not the first person that the killer has killed. And he's looking at it, and the guy's explaining how the first knife went in. The first strike was easy, and then the next ones were like defensive. And then Paul Sorvino says, "So this knife has a fingerprint," and I was just like, "Yeah, it's called forensics." What do you mean? So that was. I think that's a line for the audience, for the dummies at home, so that they understand, what they're talking about with the knife.
If we find the knife, we find the guy.
Yes, it's a very, as someone who I myself have written mystery stories before. It's a common thing when you're writing one of those that you have to find a clue. And oftentimes you'll just try to find the simplest thing that is. It has to be simple enough for the audience to understand it, but it can't be so simple that it's stupid. And then I think the knife is one of those. It's like the killer uses a short bladed steak knife. It's like that's all we really know. And so yeah, one other line of the movie which I think is, it's not terrible, but it's a little cheap, is when he's hanging out with his girlfriend for the first time, Al Pacino, and she says, I didn't know that you like to do this or that or whatever. And his response is, there's a lot of things you don't know about me. It's fine, but it's just a little on the nose, is the only issue with it. But yeah, so those are my only two little kind of criticisms that I'll throw in there. For the most part, I really enjoyed the movie. But yeah. Real quick. So it's obvious, but the precinct night, what's fun about that is cop pretending to be a gay guy is in a room full of gay guys pretending to be cops. I know that's obvious, but it's just fun. And that whole sequence, it's thematically, I think, really important to the film. It's funny because he gets made because he's not wearing a cop uniform. That's fun.
Right, which proves that he's not a frequent, because if he was a member, he would know you don't show up to precinct night not dressed like a cop. And so that I think they're the club managers, they come over to him and they're basically like, "Hey, what are you, a fucking cop?" And he's like, "Oh, what?" And they're like, "Why aren't you dressed like a cop?"
Yeah. Yeah, and it's funny because you're not sure if they're asking the question are you dressed. Oh, go ahead.
So, real quick, I just remembered this. You probably heard this. William Friedkin was saying that in order to get permission to film in those bars, he had to go to the families that own them, meaning those bars were run by the mafia. So he would have to talk to a representative of the mafia who would say it was okay, and then he had to go to the clubs themselves and get permission from the club owners. So it's a real subtle little bit of trivia, but yeah, at that time, practically all of those gay clubs were owned by the mafia.
I do know that Friedkin was friends with members of the mafia, and that's why, in some of his movies, they actually show up, and it's a way for him to be authentic about stuff, and specifically, what you're talking about there, that's really interesting because I'm assuming that they just didn't care what he was doing, because they're already criminals. So they're just like, yeah, sure, film whatever you wanted to film. People putting their fist up someone's butt, that's fine. So that was very advantageous for Friedkin. And Friedkin, one of the really interesting things about Friedkin is that he's a guy who's he doesn't judge people. He just wants to know who they are and be a documentarian basically about them.
So moving forward from the precinct night, he basically leaves the club because he doesn't want any trouble, because he's not dressed up, so he's risking, he's just like, I'll just leave, and funny enough, there's another guy there who's not dressed like a cop, and they didn't kick him out. Maybe he's dressed
That's when the guy approaches
right,
him.
and maybe he's dressed like a biker cop or something, but he doesn't seem to be dressed like a cop. But he comes out and he kind of follows him outside, and I forget his name, but he essentially then becomes he's on Burns's radar in terms of like, oh, this guy might be a suspicious character that I might have to tell Edelson about. Like, we might have to keep an eye on this guy. And correct me if I'm wrong. From there, they set up the I don't know if it's a sting operation, but they set up that entrapment where he invites him over to his place. The guys are waiting in the van, listening with this really shoddy early like police surveillance equipment, and they're trying to catch them in an act of gay business, to the point where they can say he's attempting to murder their undercover man.
Yes, it's a really strange, because I've never heard of someone trying to entrap someone into murdering, like almost murdering someone. Like, that's taking that very far.
So Friedkin mentions that the actual cop who did go undercover in the late 70s, who was doing this, the police would try these operations. And what happens in cruising is they're listening in and they can't tell exactly what's going on. Like, the equipment is just kind of shit, and they basically jump the gun. They're just like, well, we'd rather be wrong than our guy get murdered.
Thematically, this connects. It's ambiguous. They don't know what's going on.
Right.
Yeah,
That's a good point. And they apparently guns ready. They go up, they break in, they arrest both of them. And Friedkin was saying that this was actually a common thing, where they would go in and they would either go in way too early to actually have any proper conviction, or there was nothing going, like there was just no reasonable suspicion. Like, it just never worked out. And then funny little bit of trivia, or not funny, but interesting bit of trivia: the two cops in the van listening in were the actual police that were working on the actual French Connection.
Yeah, and one of them is Jurgensen, the guy who actually did the real life investigation into the bag murders, where he pretended to be a gay guy in order to do that.
Yeah, I believe so.
Because that's an element. Like, something real quick I want to note is that this novel was around, like, after the article, the novel was around, and multiple people wanted to make a movie based on cruising. The most interesting trivia bit that I heard was that Dress to Kill was originally a version of Cruising, which what's his name, Brian De Palma, turned into.
Which makes sense.
It does make sense. And it's so, like, this was a thing multiple people wanted to do, and they went to Friedkin and he said, no, I have no interest in this. But the reason that he got interested in it is because A, he knew one of the suspects in the bag murders, and B, he knew Jurgensen, the police detective who had really gone on this investigation.
Right.
That's why he was into it. So after the entrapment radio scene, we go to the interrogation scene, which is which is the funniest part of the movie. Partially, I mean, it's just funny because it's so ridiculous. It's like deliberately surrealist, and I think that Friedkin did admit that was like one of the motivations behind it. We're just gonna say it: big black guy in jockstrap slapping you in the face, right? While they're sitting there.
Apparently, my friend was telling me the police actually. The
police would actually do this. Friedkin talked about this as well, because that way, when you went into court and you told the judge that this happened, the judge would, not that the judge would not believe you, but that he would have plausible deniability to say, oh, well, you must be crazy. And he was kind of like in cahoots with the police, is the idea. That's what Friedkin said anyway. And so that's fascinating. Is that while they're talking there in the interrogation, this guy just comes in and slaps one of the characters, and yeah,
And he is a huge black guy in a jockstrap with a cowboy hat on.
and a cowboy hat, right? It's incredibly surrealist, and you're
It's
immediately
absolutely
like,
a
what?
hilarious image.
It's hilarious, and then but to me the really funny part is, so they find out at some point that this suspect doesn't have sperm somehow, like he doesn't have spermia, they say, and that's like meaning he must have had what do you call it, a vasectomy or an accident or something, or he's just like, just how he is. And so they tell this guy that they entrapped, who looks like Emil Hirsch from Into the Wild. They tell this guy, like, all right, get your pants down. And they tell him that he needs to masturbate to give them a product of semen. And this is bizarre because they're implying that he's going to do it in the room in front of them. And it's like, what? And then they say the funniest thing ever, which is they say, we're gonna dip your balls in water, and if your balls float, then you're our man. And they call it the ball float test. They say it like it's a standard thing. It's the weirdest thing ever, and I just laughed so hard.
And this is around the time then in the movie, I think, when Al Pacino is like, I don't think I'm cut out for this. Like, I didn't sign up to just, go around and do gay bashing. Like, just so I'm not about this. And again, at this point in the story, he started to actually befriend Ted. And so he does see this other person who happens to be a gay man as he doesn't, before he saw him as his way into this world. Now he actually sees another human, and he can kind of then transpose that humanity onto these other gay men that he's now seeing are just being victimized. They're just being rounded up and beat up, and he's like, look, if this is what I'm here for, I don't want any part of this. So I'm not your guy.
He also tells Edelson that he basically can't handle it. It's too much for him. And Edelson is like, you can't quit on me. The mayor wants to keep the beaches open. I need you. And so he gives him a piece of paper, a picture that has like a page that has all of it has like people that were in the first victims class. The first victim was a professor. Not the guy that we see get killed, but that's someone that gets killed before the movie starts, was a professor. And so he says, here's some pictures of people that were in this guy's class. Take a look at them, and if you see anybody that looks familiar, let me know. And he sees, I think the actor's name is Richard Cox.
It's kind of that whole Silence of the Lambs thing where that's how they catch Buffalo Bill, is they realize that the first victim he must have actually known. All the other victims he kind of went like cruising for. But Hannibal Lecter had told Clarice that the first kill is always personal.
Gotcha. Yeah, so that is definitely a connection. I mean, look, this is a killer movie. If you're into serial killer movies, that's what it is. So he recognizes Stuart Richards, and it's really kind of odd. At least it felt like this to me. He just like stalks him, and he finds the apartment where he lives, and he starts spying on him through the window. And then one day when he's out, he climbs up his fire escape and he kicks in the AC unit, because back in those days, I think it was a lot of the buildings had not been built with AC units, so they were put in after the fact, so they're just kind of stuck in a window. And so he just kicks it in, and he gets inside and he looks through his crap.
Or it's just a box fan in the window.
Right. And so he gets inside and he looks at this guy's he looks at this guy's. He finds a bunch of letters. He finds a bunch of serial killer letters. He finds a bunch of "I'm disturbed" letters. Like he starts reading them, and the camera pans down, and you only get a small excerpt of the letters, but it's exactly what you're expecting, where he's just like, Father, I don't know what has become of me. I want you so much to look up to me, Father. If only I could tell you what I have done. And one of them, he's like, the other day in the park, I saw this black form with orange energy at the
It's like
center.
700 unsent letters to his dead father.
Well, we don't know that yet, but we find out later that his father is in fact dead. We see Stuart talking to someone and talking about how his father doesn't want to give him a car for the summer because he doesn't need it, and the guy is talking to him like it's all normal. And later on at the end, this is like getting ahead, but later on at the end, he tells the police, yeah, he used to talk like his dad was still alive for some reason. But the letters, he's very clearly crazy. One interesting thing is he finds a book, and this is going to come up later in my interpretation. He finds a book called Carl Jung, Word and Image, and it is two biographies of Jung combined together. And in the second one, I believe specifically, or it doesn't, I don't know which one, but one of them specifically talks about the Red Book years. And anybody who knows about Jung, there was a period where he kind of went crazy, kind of like he was really obsessed with these hallucinations or like visions that would just be incredibly elaborate and would go on. And he wrote about them in a book called The Red Book. And one of the visions that he saw is what Stewart describes in that letter, seeing that weird thing that actually came from Jung. So, just a side note. But so after doing this, Al Pacino does a really weird thing, which is that he stands outside this guy's window and waits for him to see that he broke in, and then he just smiles at him. it's it's so weird, and it wasn't until I listened to part of the commentary track that I understood some reasoning behind it, which is that Friedkin says that he's baiting him. But like, which I guess makes sense, but to me, it's just like, what are you doing? Like, it's so weird. And so he waits for Richard to go out cruising, which is basically just wandering around looking for tail, and he meets him in the ramble, and they have a discussion. And I'm going to bring this up real briefly. Early in the movie, so the killer has this thing where he goes, "Who's here? I'm here. You're here." Right? Earlier in the film, the transsexual prostitute hustler that we were talking about tells the police, "I heard that he has this thing that he says, 'Who's here? We're here,' something like that." Well, when Al Pacino meets up with Richard, he says, "Who's here? I'm here. You're here." So Al Pacino knows the exact thing that the killer says. And when he says this to Richard, his response is very funny. So Richard knows it too. At least that's the implication. And they start talking like they're going to hook up. And he's like, "You want to go to your place or mine?" And Richard says, "Let's just do it at the park." I cannot describe how interesting this scene is, because everything they're saying is, and specifically where like everything has double meaning. But they end up, I'll just get to it. They end up going to this side area of the park, and Al Pacino goes, "Hips or lips," which is just like he's so far into this world now that he just falls easily into asking these questions. That's how I interpret it anyway. And I don't know. Yeah, do you want to take it from here, or?
Well, what I will add to that, the nursery rhyme element, that is actually taken from the real life bag murders, that a witness said they heard someone saying that in the vicinity of where a victim was eventually found. And Friedkin also said that he intentionally had it that Al Pacino is the only person you actually, besides the killer, the only character you see saying that nursery rhyme because, again, when you get to the end of the movie and the open-endedness and what it all might mean, he was trying to add more weight to the argument that Al Pacino's character is the killer, which is like, huh, okay. Another interesting thing with this scene with them hooking up, and this is another thing that's another argument for the sake of Al Pacino being the killer. He's the one who draws the knife first, and they're in this like little secluded area. He pulls his knife out, and then the guy, Stuart Richards, feeling threatened, pulls out his knife, and then remind me if it's like a brief scuffle or if he just like.
Al Pacino literally instigates the incident because the guy pulls his pants down, and then Al Pacino steps on his pants in between his feet as if to kind of like throw him off balance, and that's what starts it. He, just like with the thing with the guy on the radio, he is provoking this situation, and so you're just like, how do you even know the guy's really the killer? He's obviously crazy, but how do you know he's really the killer if you instigated the conflict?
Right.
And so Al Pacino stabs him with. They both have like the same knife again, and the guy. It just cuts to the guy in bed, and Sorvino's there. Edelson's there, and
The hospital bed.
he tells him the hospital bed. Sorry, yeah, and he's like cuffed or whatever. And Edelson tells him that if he confesses to all of the murders, they will give him 8 years. And I wanted to go out and protest. It was such a bizarre. I was like, oh my God, 8 years. Like, they think he's gay Jack the Ripper, and they want to give him 8 years. Like, I can't believe that. But anyway, so
it's crazy because it shows that they're more concerned about solving this now, and if he comes out in 8 years and more gay men start disappearing, it's like, well, it shows that they don't care about the victims as much as, well, we got him for now, and when he gets out in 8 years, if he starts doing it again, we know who he is. We'll just get him again. But they just really wanted to shut the lid on the main case.
Yeah, it's like the justice system is an arm of the political branch. It's like it's there just to cover the mayor's ass, and they don't. It's not really concerned for stopping anything or preventing anything. It's just like, you're here so people don't elect someone else, which is very realistic, and it goes along with Friedkin's take on everything. So real quick, he's speaking in the voice again because he's like messed up and he got stabbed, and in the voice he says, "I never killed anyone," which is so he never admits it. To the end of the film, he never admits it. Sorvino says, "Good job, kid. You knocked him dead." They have a kind of a cheap piece of dialogue that reminds me of the extra scene at the end of The Exorcist that where the guy's like, he says the thing from Casablanca. I forget what it is, but like in this movie, he goes, he mixed up his name originally, and so when he leaves, he references that. He goes, "See ya, Edelman," and he goes Edelstein. So they kind of both say the wrong name. Then he goes home, and then they cut to Ted. Ted has been murdered. And that's the thing. We have the cops from the beginning of the movie are there, the guys who abused the hustlers, and Edelson is there, and I'm assuming they called him down because it's like, this looks like the previous killings, because otherwise why would the chief or whoever he is be there? And he looks at the situation, he tells him the whole thing. Interestingly, he recognizes the name DeSimone from The Hustler. But the big thing is, he tells him this guy's been murdered. It's Ted, who we know, and his boyfriend's missing. And we met his boyfriend earlier. We totally skipped the scene where there was a confrontation between Al Pacino and Gregory.
When Al Pacino comes, when he's sitting in his apartment and he kind of overhears them having a lover's quarrel, and he becomes very like uncomfortable, and then in a later scene, then he goes looking for Ted, and Ted's partner answers, and he's basically defensive, like Ted's not here, and it clearly is very like, it's sort of protective, but it's more so like jealous. Like, he doesn't trust Al Pacino. He thinks he might be trying to, move in on his on Ted.
Yeah, he says that Ted does this a lot. He basically implies that Ted is like, hooks up too much, and that he gets too attached to the people that he hooks up with. Like, that's what he says to him. And Al Pacino, as he's going back to his apartment, the Gregory like calls him trash. I forget exactly the line, but he calls him trash. And Al Pacino starts walking back, and Gregory shuts the door. He like yells at him, and Al Pacino like knocks the door violently, like knocks on it, and it actually moves the door. And you're like, oh my god! And then he goes, and Gregory stupidly unlocks and opens the door to check to see, because I guess they don't have a peephole. And then Al Pacino just kicks that shit in, and he just kicks that stuff in, and he just starts wailing on him. And then Gregory, in self defense, pulls out a knife, and he halts at the knife, and real quickly, the knife just so happens to be a fairly short knife. When I remember when that happened, I was like, okay, so is Ted a killer? Like, what's going on? But this is Gregory. But so that happened earlier. He like broke in, and then he like get away, and he finally left. So at the end of the movie, Ted is dead. He was killed with the same knife, it looks like, that Greg threatened Al Pacino with earlier. The cops say, well, probably Greg killed him, but we don't know where Greg is. And he tells him, oh, the guy down the hall was named Forbes, which is the alias that Al Pacino's character was using, and he knows that, of course. And so he has this look of realization, like, oh my god, like
The name that William Friedkin kept saying in the commentary.
did he keep saying Forbes?
He kept calling him Forbes, which I was like, who the fuck is Forbes? And then I was like, oh, it's his alias. It's his undercover name.
Nobody's gonna remember the alias. Like, why would he do that? That is so ridiculous. I had to turn off the commentary with just Friedkin because a lot of it was him describing the film and also reiterating things that he'd already said like years ago. So I had to switch to the other one with Mark Kermode, and at least Kermode asks him, like, he interjects and asks him questions about stuff. So it's more interesting in that respect. But okay, so Ted is dead, Gregory is missing, and the police chief finds out, oh, my man was in this apartment, and he was down the hall. So that's weird because that's a weird coincidence. And then he goes over to look at the body, and the implication is he's thinking like, okay, this is really strange. And then we cut to Al Pacino has come home to his girlfriend, and he's shaving, and he says, I'm back. And, can I stay? Meaning, like, can we be boyfriend and girlfriend again? Because they broke off earlier in the film. And she says, yeah. And then he just starts shaving. And while he's shaving, she finds the hat and sunglasses, which are typically worn by the killer in the film. And she starts trying them on herself and wearing them. Like, ooh, this looks cool. And while he's shaving, the camera zooms in on his face, and he looks at the camera, and then it fades from that into a boat moving across the water. Now, I'm assuming, like, this might be obvious, but my assumption, the implication is to me is they're going to find Gregory in the water, but who knows?
There's also a little part that we sort of talked about, but we kind of missed going in a little better detail, is the scene where Stuart Richards goes and he's meeting with his father at like the park bench, and he looks at him. And,
yes, he talks to his dead dad. Yes.
Yeah, and his father has the same voice as the killer, and he just looks at him and he says, "You know what you have to do." And there's a
yes.
So for the majority of the audience, it's perhaps that, oh, his homophobic father is calling him to arms, to action, to like kill other gay men, to purge that side of himself. But something that Friedkin pointed out is that he kind of left it open where it's like, is that what's going on? Or did the dad actually not even know that his son was gay?
Maybe the movie should have ended with the end? ?
Coming 1982, Cruising Part 2. Another detail that it's easy to gloss over, but Friedkin actually points it out, is one of the first scenes you see Al Pacino with his girlfriend. She mentions to him that I think his father has called, or his father left a message or something, and he kind of has this thing about it, and that's supposed to show the similarities of Burns has with Stuart Richards, where they both have unresolved father problems.
And this is a typical thing, like with stereotypes about gay men in general too. So that's another reason why a lot of people would probably be bothered by the Stuart Richards character. I think that, like I say, he's the closest connection to the stuff in the book that's like a little iffy for people.
Right.
That's the plot.
Hey guys, if you made it to the end of this video, thank you very much, or podcast, I guess I should say, depending on how you are imbibing this. So we had to break this up into 2 parts. Well, we will see. This might actually be longer. This first recording went way longer than we had anticipated. And so next time, for part 2 at least, our plan will be to talk about the similarities from the book to the film, as well as talk about our interpretations of the film, and then we will each give our individual scores of the jalliness of the movie. We have a 1 to 5 score system to break down how much we think the plot, the characters, the visual and sound styles are, and hopefully we can get that all in part 2. Also, just wanted to point out that we did have technical issues while recording this. The software we were using, you apparently need to have a supercomputer to use, and Nathan's, is not quite a supercomputer, not yet. So that is why his video footage was very choppy. Next time we will probably either just be using audio, or if we can get a new computer there, hopefully we have good usable video footage. Thank you so much, and see you at the next one.